Are you comfortable with your sense of existence? For most of 2025, I felt pretty good about mine, and that's despite recovering from the state of emotional trauma that Nier Automata left me in. And then a game called Clair Obscur comes along. Yeah, safe to say it all went out the window again, and now I'm back in a fetal position swimming in a pit of my own existential dread. Jokes aside, Clair Obscur is one of the most profound games that I've played in a long time. And it isn't just a deep story with cool plot twists thrown in. It's a game that challenges us to discover meaning in a world where everything is temporary. It's also a playable exploration of these 5 key questions that have haunted French philosophers for centuries. How do we choose when every path leads to suffering? What role does memory play in preserving those we've lost? Are we authors of our own identity, or merely characters in our own fiction? Where do we draw the line between simulation and reality? And perhaps most hauntingly, can art transform grief? Or does it just postpone it? Of course, while the game can be enjoyed without knowing a thing about philosophy, understanding its French roots will give you an even deeper appreciation of its themes. So let's go over some of the ways that French cultural theory shapes the game's narrative choices, character development, and central questions. Just as painters like Caravaggio and Rembrandt used dramatic lighting to emerge forms from darkness, Sandfall Interactive pull meaning from the contrast between existence and non-existence, memory and oblivion, reality and simulation. The Gommage perfectly reflects the French theme of l'angoisse. You can think of it as an overwhelming sense of dread that comes when you realize you have to make choices about your life, while knowing that everything will eventually end anyway. Yeah, not particularly great dinner table conversation, unless your friends are all tortured artists and philosophers. But regardless, these sorts of questions were a big part of 20th century French philosophy, spearheaded by thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre writes, "Death is not my possibility of no longer realizing a presence in the world, but rather an always possible annihilation of my possibilities, which is outside my possibilities." In other words, death isn't optional or negotiable. It's something that happens to us beyond our control. This is what makes the Gommage truly terrifying. It's not just another way to die. It's death on a schedule. They only need to look outside their bedroom window at the looming number on the monolith to be simply reminded about their mortality. And this confronts them with the awareness that every choice matters, precisely because time is finite. That uncomfortable feeling of having to choose how to live while knowing you can't escape the erasure of the Gommage, that's l'angoisse. It's not just fear of being erased, it's the weight of having to decide what matters when everything is temporary.
You know, that's the insidious thing about the Gommage. It's predictable, almost gentle. It makes Lumiere complacent and accepting, but the Gommage is equally violent than death. Death is just as final.
This whole predicament of being doomed to extinction but choosing to do something about it anyway mirrors Albert Camus' concept of the absurd. For Camus, life's big joke is that we desperately want meaning, while the universe couldn't give a damn about providing it. But don't get it twisted. Camus wasn't all doom and gloom. In The Myth of Sisyphus, he basically argued that, yeah, pushing that boulder uphill for eternity is pretty pointless. But Sisyphus will figure out a way to make it enjoyable anyway. While it's not exactly optimism, it's definitely not nihilism either. And by saying screw fate and sailing out of Lumiere despite the terrible odds, the expeditioners are creating their own meaning. It's like they're saying, oh, the Gommage is inevitable? Whatever, we're still gonna try. They're not just engaging in a hopeless resistance. They're showing what makes humans kind of amazing. Our stubborn insistence on finding purpose, even when the universe tells us there isn't any. Their mission isn't pointless, precisely because they decided it has a point. And here's the thing. What makes it even more meaningful is that they're not just doing it for themselves, but for those who come after. When one falls, we continue. This motif, repeated throughout the game, challenges us with the question, how do we continue in the face of loss? As we move through the story, we find almost every character carrying their own version of grief. As Victor Hugo wrote in Les Misérables, the memory of an absent being grows bright in the darkness of the heart. The more it has disappeared, the more radiant it is. The despairing and gloomy soul sees that light in its horizon, star of the interior night. This echoes Jacques Derrida's writings in The Work of Mourning, where he explains that true, faithful grieving is not something we can ever fully complete. Instead, it's a continuous process that brings the absent into our lives. These seemingly clairsentient abilities aren't just convenient fantasy tropes. They function as powerful metaphors for how memory persists beyond physical presence. As characters share their stories of the departed, they're not simply reminiscing, they're actively maintaining connections to their essence. This makes Clair Obscur not just a compelling game, but an essential piece of media for anyone processing loss. These moments reject the common narrative that grief is a linear journey that ends in closure. And it understands that healing doesn't mean burying trauma, but instead, letting those we've lost continue to shine brightly within us, even after death. Alright, so this is a good spot to talk about masks for a bit, and how they underpin one of the story's main themes, identity. You ever meet someone who's a completely different person depending on who they're with? That's what French philosopher Paul Ricoeur was obsessed with. He spent years thinking about how we're all basically walking, talking stories. And this is what he called narrative identity. The idea that we're forever rewriting ourselves based on what happens to us. Think of it like this. For Ricoeur, identity is like a skill tree that we're constantly respecking over and over again. We keep leveling up different aspects of ourselves, redistributing our skill points based on new circumstances. For better or worse, we're the authors of our own characters. So back to Clair Obscur. If we take Aileen, for example, the painting becomes a lie she tells herself as she edits out her grief and replaces it with something she can actually live with. The game shows us how these self-created stories can become a mask that we not only wear, but force upon others. Alicia wears one to cover her physical scars, and it's reinforced in Verso's story as he hides his true identity and motives from the expeditioners. It's all about what we show to the world versus what we keep hidden, and what happens when those masks finally come off. The theme of masks are not only interwoven into Clair Obscur's story and symbolism, but also into wider French cultural theory. This tension between authenticity and performance embodies the French concept of le masque, a recurring motif in their literature, theatre, art, and film, which is often used to explore themes of identity and deception.
People want so badly to know what's behind the mask. Front, back, recto, verso. Great art is both window and mirror. Whether it's your mask or theirs.
Perhaps the most provocative philosophical question that Clair Obscur poses is about the nature of reality itself. If Lumiere is a painted world, a fiction created by the family, does that make its inhabitants less real? These characters display all the hallmarks of consciousness. They show emotions and memories, form relationships, and express hopes and fears of the future. We're forced to confront whether their fictional origin makes their existence any less meaningful. Jean Baudrillard's concept of simulacra argues that simulations can become hyperreal, more real than reality itself. The simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth. It is the truth which conceals that there is none. This is the idea that the distinction between real and simulated consciousness begins to dissolve. And as we get closer to these characters, we can't help but care about these painted beings. Suddenly they matter, and their existence feels like it should count for something. In Andrei Tarkovsky's film Solaris, we encounter a vision of grief that eerily mimics what we see in the Descendre family's painted world. As a quick overview, the film's story revolves around a sentient planet that manifests physical entities drawn from the astronauts' memories and subconscious. These aren't just merely copies. They develop consciousness, emotions, and eventually, existential dread. The planet's manifestations in Solaris and the painted people in Clair Obscur both force us to question the distinction between fiction and reality. Each of these stories pose the same haunting question. Is clinging to replicas of what we've lost an act of love or a refusal to face reality? The game and movie don't provide us with any easy answers, but instead reveal that sometimes the human heart chooses comfort over truth. As Simone de Beauvoir argued in The Ethics of Ambiguity, freedom is the source from which all significations and values spring. Here's the thing about French existentialists. They were absolutely obsessed with the concept of freedom. After living through Nazi occupation in France, philosophers like Sartre and de Beauvoir didn't see freedom as some abstract concept. For them, it was everything. Man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. In other words, we can't escape making choices, even when these choices are impossible. There's no official rulebook that we can reference here. We as players, we have to figure it out ourselves. Let's look at some of the ways Clair Obscur's endings get us to think about freedom, and how it can also turn into our own living hell. For real Verso, painting was the ultimate expression of freedom, a creative outlet from childhood that gave birth to a world. However, for painted Verso, this ironically is a symbol of his eternal prison. And that's why he turns to music instead, right? He doesn't want to be reminded of his mortality. He seeks a new form of expression that hasn't yet been corrupted. If you choose Mael's ending, as we all know, it gets pretty dark. Verso's musical expression becomes yet another form of captivity. Freedom transforms into a new prison, completing the tragic circle of enslavement. But what about Alicia's freedom? The fire didn't just take her brother. It stole her sight, her voice, and her sense of self. Through Mael, she finds freedom, a way to experience the world without the constant weight of her physical and emotional scars. The game forces us to confront the existentialist dilemma directly. Whose freedom matters more?
This is all you have left of your son. Destroying it won't bring your wife back. It will only destroy the last tie you have to each other.
The choice is further complicated by what the painting means to the family, their last, tangible connection to their lost loved one. And as we explored earlier when discussing reality versus fiction, there's also the question of all the other painted inhabitants. Lune, Ciel, the Gestrels, and all of Lumiere's citizens are essentially fighting for their own freedom and continued existence. By destroying the painting to free Verso, we're making a decision to remove their liberties. It's yet another impossible choice, weighing one person's freedom against the existence of an entire population. There are no easy answers, and that's the point. It's why fans of the game continue to passionately debate what the right ending is. Both positions are simultaneously defensible and flawed, and in my opinion, that's exactly what the developers intended. To wrap up, Clair Obscur Expedition 33 shows how video games can tackle big philosophical ideas in ways other media simply can't. Instead of just telling us about these concepts, the game lets us experience them firsthand through our choices and our actions. The genius is in how everything works together to get us thinking about mortality and meaning. As Sartre wrote, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. In Clair Obscur, our choices don't just reveal who these characters are, they reflect who we are. And by refusing to offer any clear-cut answers to its biggest questions, we're instead taken on an expedition through moral ambiguity. And perhaps that's the game's most profound statement. That meaning isn't written in absolutes, but painted with gradients of light and shadow. And as the painted world teaches us, nothing lasts forever, including this video essay. But if you've enjoyed the video and you want to consider supporting the channel, why not head over to everyonesgrudge.com and pick up some cool gaming merch. I've also got some free wallpaper packs and some video game remixes on there too that I've made. But yeah, with all that said and done, until our next expedition into video game philosophy, I'll be embracing the uselessness of today while readying my usefulness for tomorrow. Thanks for watching.